So Churchill was born in 1874. He described himself in his book My Early Life as a child of the Victorian age, and I think this is important for understanding his worldview. That's not to say that all the views that he had in the year 1900 or 1901 when Victoria died then stayed with him completely unchanging throughout his life. It's more complicated than that. But he undoubtedly had a perspective that was heavily influenced by the views of the late 19th century. Now, as a young man, he in general didn't excel brilliantly at school. He did well in some subjects such as English and history, but his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, decided that he wasn't smart enough to go to the bar and become a lawyer, and decided that it would be a good idea for him to have a military career instead. And so he went through Sandhurst and in 1896 shipped out to Bangalore, where he lived in many ways an exceedingly privileged life with large numbers of servants to attend him, but also a very boring life in certain respects, because there were very, very hot days. The regimental routine was accomplished in the mornings, and then there was sort of long periods of nothing to do until it was time for dinner. And so that for somebody who had a very sort of active and dynamic mind, he simply found the experience very tedious. He actually went through a phase of self-education at this point, because he felt that he hadn't benefited enough from school, that he kind of hadn't been to university and therefore wanted to acquire lots of knowledge. So he did occupy himself often through a very extensive program of reading. But at the same time, he was somebody who clearly had contact with Indians in terms of Indian soldiers who were subordinate to him, and he had contact with his servants, but he didn't have ordinary discourse with ordinary Indian people. Nor does he seem to have had any particular interest in acquiring that. He doesn't have had any interest in acquiring any of the local languages. And he said many years later to his doctor, Lord Moran, that these experiences made it difficult for him to treat Indians on equal footing. And so his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, was based on his experiences fighting in a frontier war on the northwest frontier of India. A very violent, shocking experience in many ways. He was able to deal with that, perhaps because he saw these unpleasant experiences as the necessary price of what he saw as the expansion of the British Empire, the expansion of civilization. And that he therefore doesn't, although he saw some absolutely horrific events, he seems to have found a way of sort of not having to deal with them emotionally, if you like, to see them as a natural and inevitable part of imperial progress, which I think may help shape, may have helped shape his view of famine and disease. It is worth emphasising that when he was there as a young man, there was an episode of plague which he perhaps took a rather callous attitude towards at that time. And equally, that in terms of how British people in Victorian England saw famine and pestilence in India, it was really a fairly normal thing from their perspective. That's not to say that they weren't shocked by it. It's not to say that they didn't feel some pity for the people who experienced it. It's not to say that they didn't think things should be done to mitigate it, but perhaps at the margins, rather than this is something to which we can find a long-term cure. Since this was seen as part of the inevitable process of life, that these people were in general seen as more primitive than white Anglo-Saxons, and were therefore, wasn't that they were regarded as completely inhuman or unhuman or non-human, but that their lives were not thought to be of great account, that they were a relatively low priority. And I think that these experiences of it being expected that periodically large numbers of Indian people would die from causes which were not thought to be really susceptible to cure, was something which probably Churchill internalised, and that he may even have seen it as part of a kind of natural evolutionary process, so that one of the books that he read in India as a young man was really a history which tried to show how sort of human suffering was a necessary part of a gradual evolutionary process. Now, I'm sure that Churchill wouldn't have regarded that suffering as something acceptable if it had been happening to him, but in terms of how he looked at these sort of great, appalling, shocking loss of human life, I think that it was something which he was able to distance himself from. So I think it's probably worth sort of skipping back to where the British Empire stood in 1939 and 1940, and thinking about that in many ways Britain was a strong power in 1939, as many historians now emphasise, technologically powerful, with great resources within the empire, and yet that came under enormous threat, first of all in 1940, but even more severely early in 1942. So from Pearl Harbor onwards, in a way that's a great relief to Churchill, this event, because it means that America is going to be brought into the war. But in the Far East, of course, it is a disaster for British power, and the strength of the Japanese forces was woefully underestimated, not only by Churchill but by the British in general. There was considerable complacency, the real difficulty in believing that non-white people would be able to achieve such rapid military superiority and demonstrate such skill. And so in February 1942, the fall of Singapore, a very dangerous political moment for Churchill at home, and also, of course, a devastating moment for the British Empire. So this is an episode which is seen as not merely a military setback, and Britain has had plenty of those in the period since 1940, but really as a kind of humiliation, seen as the fact that the Japanese and non-white people who have inflicted on this defeat is seen as more of a problem than the Germans inflicting defeats, or the Italians inflicting defeats nearer home. So that Churchill's strategy, actually quite rightly, is to focus on the Middle East, sees this as a more important theatre, and yet the sort of the emotional significance of Singapore is much greater, so that Churchill, not long after this great military disaster, his doctor encounters him, and Churchill sort of is there looking very downcast and depressed, and says, I cannot get over Singapore. Now, in political terms, he does actually survive it. He reconstructs his government, and but at the price that he has to pay is the launching of the so-called Cripps mission, which is to send Sir Stafford Cripps, the former an MP who'd formerly been a member of the Labour Party and at this time was an independent who had recently been British ambassador to Moscow. He is sent to try and negotiate a settlement with the representatives of the Indian nationalists, which of course fails. And Gandhi launches the Quit India movement in the summer of 1942, and that is very, very harshly repressed. So that is perhaps at least as shocking as anything that happened in terms of the Bengal Famine, because it is violence that is very, very deliberately inflicted. And so, and to a degree, that because the repression is basically successful for the time being, then that manages to push the problem off the political agenda for a while. And Churchill is probably sort of heartily sick of the Indian question, which has sort of popped up at various times from 1940 onwards. I mean, of course, what you've got to remember is crucial, that in 1939, the Viceroy simply declares war on behalf of the Indian people, the assumption that if Britain is in the war, then India will automatically be in it too, and therefore there isn't any consultation, which is certainly a catastrophic political mistake. Whether or not more consultation would have brought about Indian support for participation in the war is a different question, but certainly that was the sheer lack of consultation really epitomised how little significance the British authorities appeared to attribute to Indian opinion at a time when, of course, they desperately needed Indian soldiers and recruits in order to fight the war. So, why did the British government respond more quickly and effectively to the Bengal famine? Well, this operates at various levels. We've got to appreciate that obviously the British government, the Indian government were not the same thing. There were sometimes, let's say, issues of communication, I mean, the actual physical communications were fine, but whether or not Lord Wavell, who was somebody who was not taken particularly seriously, not particularly strongly admired by Churchill, was going to succeed in communicating what he was trying to get across, is sort of open to question, really. So that, first of all, there's the question of the Indian government having to take this seriously and recognise that this is something that is going to require, that can't be solved locally, that is going to require an appeal to London to sort it out. Secondly, there's Wavell, first of all, communicating with Leo Amery, who was the Secretary of State for India, somebody who'd been at school with Churchill, as a matter of fact, although they had a rather difficult relationship, not necessarily a very warm or friendly one. So it wasn't automatic that even if his old school friend went to see him, that Churchill was going to listen to Amery, who himself could be a sort of a difficult, long-winded person. But essentially, eventually, Wavell does succeed in getting Amery's attention, and then Amery has to try and get Churchill's attention. And this is where the real problem sits, because I think that without trying to defend Churchill, just to explain his viewpoint and the way that he saw things, he was trying to focus on winning the war. He was obviously having huge numbers of issues of all kinds thrown at him on a day-by-day basis. By 1943, he was arguably past his best, but partly through sheer exhaustion, which was partly due to his own relatively poor working habits and tendency to stay up late at night and so on. But somebody who'd been very on the ball in 1940, was aging, was under huge amounts of pressure, and really had a predisposition to see an awful lot of issues, including, in fact, domestic reform in the UK, as some things which were not priorities and were distractions from what he saw as the central task of trying to defeat Hitler. And therefore, to his mind, this was essentially yet another distraction. And added to that, I think it's fair to say that his negative view of Indians, which even Amery said in his diary at times seemed to verge almost on insanity, that Churchill simply reacted sort of strangely and irrationally when the topic came up. It was very, very difficult in those circumstances for Amory to get his message across and to get the necessary shipping diverted. And so certainly there are very unpleasant remarks which Churchill made about sort of Indians breeding like rabbits. I think it's also worth mentioning the role of Lord Cherwell, F.A. Lindeman, as he had previously been, who was a trusted advisor of Churchill, seen by many as a crony of Churchill, somebody who kind of told him what he wanted to hear, and he was the head of the Prime Minister's statistical branch, and had a habit of whipping out his slide rule in order to demonstrate whatever point that he wanted to make, and making various calculations and making the claim, interestingly, in view of later academic analyses of what happened in the Bengal Famine, making the claim that there wasn't actually a shortage of food, but there was hoarding going on. And so, with all these things taken together, really, I would not hesitate to describe Churchill as a racist, with a particular animus against Indians, who he was at this time particularly upset about because of all the political movements that had been going on, with clearly a fairly intense dislike of Gandhi himself. And therefore, in those circumstances, he saw requests for shipping as something that was likely to damage the war effort, and really, fundamentally, as the most terrible bloody nuisance. It's important to appreciate that trying to deal with food and materials and supplies in general for the whole of the British forces and for the various populations for which they were responsible for was a sort of a huge logistical nightmare, and that there were clearly competing pressures between different commands, different government departments, different authorities who felt that it was important to get food to a particular area at a particular time. Now, clearly, in this case, in Bengal, that was very much that there were serious mistakes that were made that were extremely bad for the populations of those areas. I mean, of course, these issues of course, famine was not a new phenomenon within the British Empire. And if you go back to the Irish famine of the 1840s, then of course there were cases of sort of food being exported, perfectly good food, which was essentially sold for export to England, when it might have been used to feed the population of Ireland. But of course the question in all these cases is, whose food is it? Who has got the authority to move it? Can the authorities, I mean, of course, with very extensive wartime powers, you can argue on the one hand the authorities had enormous problems, but they did also have potentially enormous powers to deal with them. And clearly, in certain cases, they failed to exercise those powers in an effective or competent way. And really, the fundamental question then becomes, was there malice involved? There was plenty of the whole of World War II, looked in a certain perspective, was simply an exercise in massive incompetence. That this is not a particularly sensible way to try and run the world. And really, the question therefore becomes, who was more spectacularly incompetent than the other lot, and who was acting with malice and who was acting with good intentions but getting things wrong. So during the 1930s, the period when Churchill is best known for having campaigned for rearmament and warned of the dangers of appeasement and warned of the dangers of Hitler and the Nazis, were also a period when he spent an awful lot of effort campaigning against greater self-government for India and against the India Act, as it became, that was finally passed in 1935, and in fact forms the basis for much of the modern Indian constitution as well. Why did Churchill spend all this effort in the 1930s campaigning against self-government for India? arguably partly for political reasons, that he stood down from the Conservative front bench in 1931 at the point where the Conservatives were out of power in order to campaign on this issue, because he saw Stanley Baldwin, the leader of the Conservative Party, as soft on the issue, too willing to potentially make moves towards giving India so-called dominion status, that is to put it more on the equivalent status for Canada or Australia, and therefore he may have seen an opportunity to sort of use this issue to stir up right-wingers within the Conservative Party and seize the leadership of the party. In so doing, he radically overestimated the strength of feeling on this particular issue. That is to say that there were plenty of people within the Conservative Party who were against self-government for India, and yet they didn't necessarily prioritise that as an issue or think that it was an issue which would cause them to be disloyal to the leadership of the Conservative Party. So, but I think that the two questions are, did Churchill really believe this? Was he sort of profoundly committed to this cause? And on the other hand, was he opportunistic, which would suggest that he didn't really believe it? But I think it's perfectly possible to reconcile the two, insofar as the reason why he miscalculated, if you like, why he thought it might be an opportunity to put himself at the head of the Conservative Party and therefore potentially become Prime Minister, was because he himself was so emotionally invested in it that he didn't see that other people were going to react otherwise. And so you've got, I think you could argue both that he did want to use this as a political tool and that he was profoundly ideologically committed to this cause of opposing the India Act. Well, I think it probably wasn't particularly well publicised in Britain at the time, as a matter of fact, bearing in mind that there was a shortage of newsprint, there was paper rationing, that the newspapers were much smaller than they had been before World War II, and that there was clearly an awful lot of global news that had to be fitted in to that space. I think it's also fair to say that by this stage, the British, many of them retained a kind of a vague emotional commitment to the empire, but were not actually profoundly interested or knowledgeable about the details of it. And I think that although this was an issue which was of interest to a kind of a relatively sort of small minority of radical left-wingers. I mean, they weren't that small a minority in 1940s Britain because, of course, Labour won the election of 1945. But nonetheless, that was something which was going to attract relatively little interest in Britain at the time, doesn't really cause any sort of great political scandal, even really amongst the many people who were critical of Churchill, that there were a lot of reasons why people who disliked Churchill attack him in the 1940s. They bring up, for example, his interventions or support for British intervention in the Russian Civil War. They bring up his record in the 1926 general strike. They brought up Gallipoli and the Dardanelles over and over again. And yet the Bengal famine was simply not one of those issues going into the 1945 general election. Nobody tried to turn it into a campaigning issue. Now, in a sense, that has an effect on how historians have then written about the topic and the issues which they prioritise as important. But I think it's also worth saying that Churchill is remembered in Britain for really quite a limited part of his political life, so that he is remembered for campaigning against the Nazis in the 1930s. He obviously is remembered for World War II and for 1940 in particular. He's remembered for a small select number of the many speeches that he gave, a relatively small number of famous quotations. and people are actually vastly ignorant of huge chunks of his previous career and his later career. Maybe the Iron Curtain speech of 1946 rings a bell with a few people. And so of his many very different activities over a very, very long political career, there's only a small amount that is remembered. And of course, the bits that are remembered in Britain tend to be those bits which chime well with a national story of Britain's greatness, standing alone, being sort of almost uniquely virtuous, if you like, in the fight against Hitler. And so things which don't fit with that tend not to work very well or to be very widely spread. You will find that memories of Churchill are much different in the United States and Britain, where he's seen almost uniformly positively, with other countries throughout the world, some such as France, where he's seen with relative indifference, others such as India, many countries in Africa, where he is seen as a very negative, brutal, imperialistic figure.
So today, can we consider that Bengal famine as a human disaster or a war disaster?
Or is it a war crime?
Or
Well, I'm not qualified to say from a legal perspective whether or not it should be considered a war crime. As a general observation, I would say that it was a war disaster compounded by very serious incompetence, by the structural racism of the British Empire, and by the failings and neglect of the issue by Churchill himself. So I think that it must be remembered that the famine was not deliberately engineered by the British. All other things being equal, Churchill would have been quite happy for the Indian people in Bengal not to starve. I think it also probably should be said that there were some representatives of British India, including Wavell, including Ian Stevens, who was the editor of the Statesman newspaper, who made an effort to publicise this. That the British shouldn't be seen uniformly as neglectful, incompetent or indifferent to the suffering of Indians. I think where Churchill is concerned, this was certainly one of the greatest blots on his record, if not the greatest blot, and it is clear that he made callous statements, he made racist statements concerning this. He did not give the issue the priority that it deserved. I think that I would still stop short of saying that that actually made him, in moral terms, a war criminal. Well, Churchill clearly remains a very venerated figure in Britain today, as putting his face on the new £5 note demonstrates. I think it's worth saying that he is a contested figure and that he has always been so during his life and to a great extent also in the years after his death, so that although there is a kind of national myth, if you like, that everybody thrilled to the sound of Churchill's speeches in 1940, actually the story is much more complicated. In fact, there was much more controversy around those speeches and criticism of him than the legend suggests, which is not to say they weren't good speeches, but the historical reality is that people wanted to argue with him, many on the left saw his record in the past as something to be suspicious of. And I think that those feelings have gone through to the present day as a minority strand of opinion, so that certainly there's a majority strand, uncomplicated, Churchill was great, yet there's never has there ceased to be this strong dimension or undercurrent, if you like, of criticism. Not all of it fair. I mean, some of it can be quite sort of harsh and exaggerated, and simply claiming that he was drunk all the time and a complete fool, which is not the case. And so he certainly remains relevant in current politics. He remains relevant in current politics in the United States as well as in Britain. But in a way, I think that one of the issues is that there are certain things about Churchill which are genuinely so complicated to understand his position that they don't map neatly onto the kind of political debates that people really want to have today. So the key example would be Europe. I mean, we've just been through the so-called Brexit referendum. Now, Churchill has been deployed in the years running up to the referendum. Churchill was deployed to sustain basically every position on Europe which it is possible to hold, from simple withdrawal to renegotiation to staying in, and the argument that Churchill was an enthusiastic European who would have been definitely on the Remain side. Well, without going into all of the history of that, it's certainly a lot more complicated than that actually Churchill's position in the late 1940s was so complicated, so ambiguous in many ways, variegated, that he shifted his position over time, that you can't easily slot him in and say, like, he belongs to us. It shows that people still, I guess, what's important about the use of which was made of Churchill with respect to Europe is that even if people didn't successfully do it, that he was the guy who people wanted to say, we can wheel him in and claim that whichever side we're on, we want to claim that this guy was on our side. They generally don't do that with Clement Attlee. They don't do it with Alec Douglas Hume. They don't do it with Harold Macmillan. They don't do it with James Callaghan. To a degree, they do it with Margaret Thatcher, as a matter of fact. So there were arguments about whether or not Thatcher would have been in favour of staying in the EU or not. But he certainly has got an iconic status, and he's an individual on whom everybody has got an opinion, whether or not that opinion is actually well informed. Undoubtedly, imperialism was a factor, because what you had in British India was a society which was racially structured, with white people at the top and with non-white people being regarded as subordinate, although often consulted in many ways, and many of them having important positions and being wealthy and influential and so forth. But there's no disputing that the way in which this famine played out was massively affected by this structural racism and by the structures which British India had set up, and the way that the government had evolved. Of course, it hadn't been unchanging, but it had its roots in the particular way in which British India had been conquered over a period of centuries. And so, of course, the Japanese invasion was the key factor which triggered this particularly horrific set of events. But the way in which it then played out was, of course, massively influenced by British imperialism, by British imperial structures, and by British imperial outlook. So, although Churchill was strongly influenced by his Victorian background, it wasn't that his position was unchanging from the point that Victoria died onwards. And so for 20 years he was a member of the Liberal Party, and his first ministerial office was as a junior minister at the Colonial Office, and he was seen by right-wing critics at the time not as a die-hard right-wing imperialist, but as a kind of crazy radical who supposedly wasn't interested in the empire and was far too willing to give in to or make concessions to so-called liberal faddists, that is to say, people who were basically much too concerned, as the right-wingers saw it, about the population, the non-white population of the empire. And so therefore he was seen as somebody who was insufficiently caring about the rights of the white settler imperialists. Now, arguably, that phase doesn't last particularly long, that by the 1920s you can certainly see him moving back, even before he joins the Conservative Party, in a relatively harsh and repressive direction. But I think that when he was at the Colonial Office, he was somebody who was concerned with the fate of, say, individual railway officials in Ceylon who he thought had been maltreated by the system, and he was willing to work hard and write memoranda for justice on their behalf. So he wasn't somebody who saw non-white people as non-human. He did get on with a number of them, reasonably well. I mean, when he finally met Nehru, they seem to have, in the 1950s, they got on perfectly sort of civilized, polite basis. And yet, I think it's fair to say that ultimately, when it came right down to it, they were going to take a lower priority, so that yes, you might have Indian officers in the Royal Navy, but not too many of them, please, was what he basically said. And as long as it wasn't going to prejudice any other objective that he had, so that he didn't mind people taking a sort of a humanitarian attitude towards the people of the empire, as long as it didn't inconvenience his other priorities. And so I think that his views certainly hardened as he went on in life, and this is why I would argue that it was in the interwar years that he decided to become a Victorian. That is to say that he, at that point, decided to assert this Victorian identity, which he'd had from his youth but had moved away from, partly for political reasons, partly as a method of self-assertion. So there's, of course, this very famous quotation in 1942, just after the Battle of El Alamein, where he makes a speech in London, and he says, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." And I think that is the moment at which he sort of very, very definitively defines himself as an imperialist, using language which he knows is anachronistic by that stage. And he's basically doing that at that particular moment because that's perhaps his greatest moment of political power after this period where there have been so many setbacks, and finally the tide has turned. Finally, as he says, we've reached the end of the beginning, and therefore he feels that he can stand up and really stick it to his critics, who now are very much on the back foot, and he does that by asserting his identity as a die-hard imperialist. And that was just before the Bengal Famine started.